Masechet Ketubot Daf Ayin He. The Mishnah mentioned that kol mumin sheposlin, any blemish that will disqualify a kohen from serving, will also disqualify regarding a woman. If a man says, I didn't want any blemishes, and she has such a blemish that would disqualify a kohen, he also can claim that the marriage is invalid. Tana, hosifu alehen ze'ah v'shuma v'reach hapeh. The Baraita says that there are three other blemishes that disqualify women in addition to those that disqualify a kohen, and they are ze'ah, someone who perspires a lot, a mole, and bad breath. Then we ask about that. Wait a second, these three, do they not disqualify a kohen? They do, because look at this Mishnah in Masechet Bechorot. This Mishnah is talking about animals. An animal that is old or sick or filthy. Utnan, but we apply it to humans also. Mumin elu ben kebu'in ben obrin pesulin ba'adam. And so then another Mishnah also in Bechorot says that these blemishes, whether they are permanent or temporary, regarding people, they also disqualify. So we're assuming that here that mizoham, filthy, would be equivalent to ze'ah, sweaty, or bad breath, and so these already disqualify in a kohen. So why is this Baraita saying that these are an additional disqualifications for a woman? Amar Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina lakashya kan beze'ah oberet kan beze'ah shena oberet. The Baraita, he answers, is talking about temporary sweat that's removable. That would be a blemish regarding a wife, but not a kohen. Whereas the Mishnah is talking about ze'ah, sweat that is not removable. That is what's called mizoham. So therefore, that mizoham will be the more permanent kind, and that sweat that is permanent is mizoham, and therefore that is the one that is already a blemish regarding a kohen. So it's the removable type of sweat that is the added one for a wife. Rav Asher Amar Ze'ah Amezoham Karamet. Rav Asher is going to give yet another answer. That's actually similar to Rabbi Chanina's answer. Are you comparing Ze'ah to Zohama? These are different things, sweat and filth. Hatam Gabe Kohanim Efshal Aberah Bekiyuha de Hamra. Regarding a kohen, you can take care of the bad smell of the sweat by using wine vinegar somehow. That takes away the bad smell. And also if he has bad breath, so you can put pepper in his mouth. Nowadays, if someone eats pepper, then they have to get a mint. But they're saying that pepper will make his breath smell better, and therefore all he needs is temporary. If he's going to go and serve in the Beit HaMikdash for an hour or two, so he can temporarily remove that bad smell or the bad breath. But for a woman, it can't do that. Woman, her husband is going to want her to smell good all the time, not just for an hour or two here and there, and therefore these remedies will not work for a wife, and that's why if the person always smells bad, then cannot be a kohen either. But if they can get removed this bad smell for a little bit, then it's okay to be a kohen, but still not okay for a wife. Okay, Hai Shuma Hechidamya. Now you mentioned that a mole is an additional blemish of a wife over and above a kohen. Well, what kind of mole are we talking about? If it's a mole that has a hair in it, then that is one of the blemishes of a kohen, so that would be a blemish for both. And even if it doesn't have a hair, if it's a large size, then that would also be a blemish both for a wife and a kohen. And if the mole is small, then it's not a blemish in either case. So what are we talking about? And how do we know all this? Tanya, Shuma, sheyesh ba se'ad hareze mum. If it has a hair, it is a blemish for a kohen. En ba se'ad gedola hareze mum. Or if it's small, big, even if it doesn't have a hair, it also is a mum for a kohen and for a wife. Ketana en ze mum. If it's small, then it's not a blemish for anyone. Ve'ezuhi gedola. What's the definition of large? Pedash Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel ad ke isad ha'Italki, the size of an Italian isad coin, a pretty small coin. But if it's less than that, then it's not a blemish. So what kind of mole are we talking about that would be a blemish for a wife but not a kohen? Amar Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina be'omedet al padachta. So we're talking about something that's a mole that's on her forehead, a small mole without a hair on her forehead. That'll be okay for a kohen, but for a wife, the husband will have to see that, and he will make her look ugly. So he will be particular about that. Now he asks, "Padachta ra'aveni payesu." If it's on her forehead, then obviously he saw it when they were going out, and he means he's still okay with it. So he can't come and claim, "Oh, you had a mole that I didn't know about, and so therefore I don't want to pay the ketubah." He can't say that. He saw it and he still went ahead with the marriage. We're talking about that it's right on her forehead, and it's sometimes under her hat. Therefore, sometimes visible, sometimes it's not visible. So, anytime they were going out on their dates, she had it covered, so he didn't know about it. But sometimes it is visible and looks ugly, even though it's small, but it's on the person's face. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about, where for a kohen this would be permissible, but for a wife it is a blemish. Amar Rav Chisda, Hamilata megabra Rabba shemi ya'li umano Rabbi Shela. So Rav Chisda says, I heard the following matter from a great man, and that is Rabbi Shela. Neshach ha'kelev na'asa mekomo saleket hare ze mum. If a person was bitten by a dog and there's a scar in the place of the wound, that is called a blemish. Amar Rav Chisda, kol abe b'isha hare ze mum. Rav Chisda adds yet another. If a woman has a deep voice, that is also considered a blemish. Shene'emar ki kolech arev umarech naveh in Shir HaShirim. The man there praises his beloved that she has a sweet voice and appearance is pleasant. So you see, a sweet voice is part of what's attractive about a woman, and therefore if she has too deep a voice, it's not attractive. That's also a blemish. Did he not hear her voice when they were going out? I guess she was quiet. Taner Rabbi Natan bira'a ben dade isha tefach. So Rabbi Natan from bira'a said that between the breasts of a woman there something about one tefach, one fistful. So what does that mean? Is that good a thing or a bad thing? Sabar Rav Acha bered Rav Kameh de Rav Asher lememar tefach lemaliuta. So at first Rav Acha, the son of Rava, thought that this is a positive thing, that this is attractive to have a tefach between. Amar Rav Asher, he said that in front of Rav Asher, but Rav Asher corrected him and said, Gabebu min tanya. No, he said that regarding the blemishes, that if there's too much space in between, then that is a blemish, it's not attractive. Vechama, so how much is a good amount? Amar Abaye, shalosh espaot, 3 fingers wide. Tefach is 4 fingers. And so 3 fingers is the right amount, 4 fingers is too much. Okay, in case anyone thinks that objectifying women's bodies comes from fashion magazines and social media, well, back in Talmudic times already, they were pretty exacting about what is considered attractive and exactly dimensions of not attractive. All right, Tanya Rabbi Natan Omer, Kol isha shedateha gasin mishel chabroteha hare ze mum. Rabbi Natan says, a woman whose breasts are larger than most average of those other women around her, that also is a blemish. Vechama, how large is too large? Amar Rabbi Meyasha bar bered Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi mishmed Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi tefach. If they are 1 tefach larger than other people's. Is there such a thing that breasts that are so large, a tefach bigger than an average? In Tamar bar Hana ani ra'iti Arabiya achat shefshila dadeha lachoreha venika et bena. In fact, yes, Rabba bar Hana says that he saw a certain Arab woman that she was able to fling her breast behind her and nurse curse her child. It's important to remember that Baba Bar Hana, he's famous for a whole series of stories in Baba Batra that are extremely exaggerated stories. So it wouldn't be surprising if he was exaggerating something here. Also important to remember that Arabs, this is before Islam existed, so they're not making fun of Muslims, but rather Arabs, these nomads, Bedouin, that I guess they looked strange or acted strange, and so he's exaggerating some of their strangeness, but the point is that yes, such a possibility can exist, that this would be considered a blemish. All right, Ul Sion Amar Ish ve'ish yulad ba v'hu yichoneneha elyon. Now that we quoted one tradition in the name of Rabbi Meyasha, the grandson of Rabbi Yosha ben Navi, we're going to quote something else that he said regarding this pasuk in Tehillim that said, to Sion we will say, this man and this man were born in Sion, and Hashem should establish the city. So what is this pasuk referring to? Echad amar Rabbi Meyasha bar bered Rabbi Yosha ben Navi, echad nolad ba ve'echad hamesaper lirota. The ish, the two different people here are mentioned, or is talking about someone who was born in Sion, in Jerusalem, and also someone who was not born there, but is hoping, is eager to come and see and visit or live in Jerusalem. Both of them are get credit. Yeah, but one of us is better than two of them. In other words, someone actually born in Sion is twice as good as someone who wasn't born there, but is only looking forward to seeing it. Amar Rava v'chad minan ki salik latam adif ketre minayhu. Rava, now, who is talking about the superiority of those in Israel over those in Bavel, even though he himself was in Bavel, says one of us, if we go to Jerusalem, we are better than two people who are in Bavel and stay in Bavel. Look at Yirmiyah. When he was in Bavel, he was originally from Bavel, and he didn't even know what the rabbis are talking about. He couldn't even keep up with the shiur. He was lesser. But once he went to Bavel, now he grew in his stature double, and then he would look upon us and call us, you foolish Babylonians. So you see, just moving to Bavel, from moving from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, he was able to double in his knowledge, in his stature, and those that are already born in Israel are double even from that. The next Mishnah teaches, Hayu ba mumin ve'oda bebet abiha, ha'av sarich lehavi re'aya shemi shenit arsa hayu ba mumin halalu v'nistapecha sadehu. So we're talking about a man marries this woman and finds that she does have blemishes. And now the question is, when did those blemishes occur? If it can be proven that the blemishes were already there before the time of Kiddushin, then the man can claim this is a mekach ta'ut. I did not want to acquire a woman with blemishes, and therefore he will not have to pay the ketubah. On the other hand, if at the time of Kiddushin she did not have blemishes and they developed afterwards, then she can make the claims. At the time of Kiddushin, I was perfectly fine. So this is your loss because it happened afterwards, and that transaction of the Kiddushin is perfectly valid, and he agreed to it, and he does have to pay the ketubah. Okay, so now this Mishnah is going to distinguish between two cases of where what stage of the marriage when he found these blemishes. So if the blemishes were found while she was still living in her father's house, which means after the Kiddushin, but before the Nisu'in. In that case, since it's under the father's domain, the father is the one that has to bring proof that she got these blemishes after the Kiddushin, and therefore the Kiddushin is valid, because at the time of the Kiddushin, She had no blemishes, and so he acquired her and agreed to pay the ketubah, perfectly fine. And it's only afterwards, so his field was flooded. In other words, bad luck. If you buy something and then it breaks after you bought it, so it's your loss. But the father has to bring the proof. If the father can't prove it, then the husband will not have to pay the ketubah. Second case is nichnesa l'shut habal. After the marriage, only then he finds these blemishes. Then the burden of proof is upon the husband. She's now already under his domain, and so he has to bring a proof that these blemishes happened before the kiddushin, so that at the time of the kiddushin, she already had these blemishes. She claimed she didn't have any blemishes, and so his acquiring of her was under false pretenses, and therefore this was a false transaction. But it's the husband that has to prove it. And this is the opinion of Rabbi Meir. So according to Rabbi Meir, it would seem that the difference of the burden of proof is wherever the wife is. If she is under her father, the father has to prove it. And if it's under the husband has to prove it. This, in fact, will be the second interpretation of this Mishnah by Rav Ashi, but the Gemara is going to offer a different interpretation first. It's one of three interpretations that we'll see of the section. Okay, anyway, Chachamim say, when can a husband claim that, I found these blemishes and therefore it's a mekach ta'ut, and he can void his payment of the ketubah? Only if these blemishes are in a hidden place on her body that he couldn't see. But if it's on her face, somewhere that he can see, then we assume he saw it and he still went ahead with the kiddushin. That means he was okay with it. And so he can't make a claim afterwards and say, this is a mekach ta'ut, I wouldn't have gone ahead and done the kiddushin had I known this. It's obvious. It's right there on her face. So obviously he knew and he was still fine with it. If it's in a city where there is a bathhouse, then even blemishes that are on covered parts of her body, even about those he cannot make any claim, because at some point she goes to the bathhouse and he can have his relatives, female relatives, go to the bathhouse, and then they will do a check and see if she has any blemishes, and therefore we can assume that they did do that check, and he was still okay to go ahead with the kiddushin, even though there were blemishes there. So we can't come afterwards and say, now I changed my mind. No, you saw what you were acquiring, right? You examined the goods, and you still went ahead with the deal. So now you cannot go back on the deal. All right, that's the Mishnah. Now, Gemara. The Gemara is going to split the first two cases when the blemish is found in the father's house or when she is in the husband's house, and split the difference and find the contradiction between these two. In other words, it's going to ignore that as relevant, the fact that she is under her father's domain or husband's domain. It's not going to take that as relevant and just say that the first and second clauses are contradictory. So in the first clause where it says that the father has to bring a proof, so that means if the father doesn't bring a proof, then the husband is believed. So in the first clause, the husband is believed, whatever he claims, unless proven otherwise. Who's the author of this section? It must be Rabbi Yoshua, who in a prior Mishnah in Ketubot, back on Daf Yud Bet, is talking about a case where a woman is found not to be the bride is found not to be a betula after the wedding night. And the question is, when did she lose her betulim? And so Rabbi Yehoshua there says, we do not believe her, rather we believe the husband, when the husband claims that she lost her betulim before the kiddushin. She was raped, say, before the kiddushin. And therefore, when I did the kiddushin, she didn't have betulim, false pretenses, because she presented herself as a betula, and therefore, now I found out, look, she never had betulim, and even at the the time by the Kiddushin, so I'm not paying the Ketubah. And so we believe him, as opposed to her. She claims, and she comes and claims and says, at the time of Kiddushin, I had Betulim, so the Kiddushin is valid, and your commitment to the Ketubah is valid. I lost the Betulim, I was raped after the Kiddushin, before the Nisuin. So your field is ruined, it's your loss. And so Rabbi Yoshua says, we believe the husband, and so too in the Resha of our Mishnah says that the father has to prove it, meaning otherwise we believe the husband. So Rabbi Yoshua looks like he's the author of the Mishnah. By Ema Sefa, look at the second case of the Mishnah. Once she is under the husband's domain, and again, we're ignoring the fact that it happens to be under the husband's domain or not. The point here is that the law is that the husband has to bring proof, meaning without the husband bringing proof, otherwise the husband is the father is believed. The father being believed is the same as her being believed, and the father and the bride are on the same side. So the husband is believed, and that unless proven otherwise. Atan Rabban Gamliel, that would coincide with the opinion of Rabban Gamliel back in that same Mishnah on Daf Yud Bet Amar Ne'emenet, because he said that she is believed to say, I lost my Betulim after the Kiddushin. At the time of Kiddushin, I had Betulim, so the Kiddushin is valid, Ketubah is valid. I lost it in between. It's your loss. And she is believed to say that unless he can prove otherwise. And so what we have is a contradiction within this Mishnah. Okay, it's a good question. How come the Gemara is not taking the Mishnah at face value and making a distinction between the fact that she's under her father's house or in her husband's house? Perhaps it's because back in that Mishnah, there's no such distinction, even though it's an equivalent case logically. It's the same principle. And so Rabbi Yoshua and Rabban Gamliel, they don't distinguish between whether he finds, I guess there it's harder because we're finding Bitulim, and he really would only find that afterwards. Okay, but even so she's under the husband's house, and there, Rabbi Yoshua and Rabban Gamliel don't make any distinction between the fact that she is now under her husband's house or otherwise, or in their father's house. And therefore, here too, they're saying, Rabbi Yoshua and Rabban Gamliel would not make any distinction, and therefore it looks like the Resha is Rabbi Yoshua and the Sefa is Rabban Gamliel. That's our question. So Amar Rabbi Elazar Tabra Misha Shanazo Lo Shanazo. So Rabbi Elazar gives the first answer and says, in fact, you have to break the Mishnah, it's disjointed, and the author of the first clause is not the same as the author of the second clause. Rabbi Yoshua is the author of the first clause. He happened to talk about it being in her father's house, but he would claim no matter where she is, the father's house or husband's house, the father is the one that has to prove, because the husband is believed, just like in the Bitulim case, the husband is believed. Rabban Gamliel, who is the author of the second clause, and happened to mention it in the case of a husband's house, but actually it doesn't matter if she's in the husband's house, no matter where she is, the husband has to prove it because she is believed, just like back in the Bitulim case, she is believed. All right, all that is the first answer. One last tangent regarding that first answer by Rava, who's also going to happen to be the second answer. Amar Rava, lo tema Rabbi Yoshua lo azil batal chazaka de gufa kelal. We have something called a chazaka, which means a presumptive status. Whatever something was beforehand, we assume it continues to be the same thing. And therefore, we assume that a girl is a bitula, so that's her presumptive status. So, not unless proven otherwise, we can assume that a girl is a bitula going forward, or a person is tahor, unless otherwise proven that they are tameh. So that's the presumptive status. So don't think, Rava says, that Rabbi Yoshua does not have any law regarding the presumptive status. He, in fact, would apply the concept of presumptive status. And so we're talking about Rabbi Yoshua here because he's the one that says that the husband is believed to say that she lost her Betulim before the Kiddushin. That goes against the presumptive status. A Chazakah would say, well, she probably had Betulim, so let the husband be the one to prove otherwise that she lost the Betulim. before the Kiddushin. But Rabbi Yoshua says we don't follow that chazakah, so it looks like Rabbi Yoshua doesn't have the concept of chazakah at all. That's why Rava says Rabbi Yoshua does have the concept of a chazakah, but here Ela Kila Azil Rabbi Yoshua batal chazakah dekufa hechadika chazakah demamona. In this case, there is an equal and opposite chazakah of the person who possesses the money. We assume that the person who is holding the money, he keeps the money until unless otherwise proven. We assume that he has that money. He's holding the money, so he's the one that deserves that money unless someone can prove that he has to pay the money. In this case, the husband is the one holding the money, and she's claiming, "I want you to pay the ketubah because I was a betula at the time of the Kiddushin." And so since he has a chazakah because he's holding the money, she has a chazakah because she has a presumptive status that she had betulim beforehand. So these chazakahs cancel each other out. And that's why Rabbi Yoshua says in this case that the husband is believed to that she lost her betulim before the Kiddushin. But if not for the opposite chazakah, we would employ the chazakah of a body, and here's we're going to prove that Rabbi Yoshua does have such a chazakah from a different case of nigaim. If you take away the monetary holding part of it, then Rabbi Yoshua does have apply the concept of the bodily chazakah. Regarding sara'at, if the white spot comes first and then there's a white hair, that is tameh. If the hair comes first and then the white spot, that person is tahor. Safek tameh. If you're not sure, then we have to assume that it's tameh, that the white spot came first. Okay, that's Tanakama. Rabbi Yoshua Omer Keha. Rabbi Yoshua says it's dull or fading. Now, what does that mean? My Keha, Amarabba Keha Tahor. He means that it's Tahor. That's the word Keha. What he means by Keha is that she is Tahor. Why? Because of the presumptive status. Chazakah, she was tahor beforehand, unless she didn't have sarat, until you prove that she does have sarat. Therefore, since we have a safek, which came first, we can follow the presumptive status of tahara. So we see that Rabbi Yoshua, all things being equal, will have a presumptive status, will use chazakah. Only here, there's a chazakah, opposite chazakah the other way, and that's why he doesn't use that. Okay, all that was the first answer regarding the contradiction between the first and second halves of the Mishnah. And now we're going to have a second one, which is, I think, closer to the Peshat. Rava Amar. Resha kan nimseu vechan hayu. Sefa name kan nimseu vechan hayu. In the first case of the Mishnah, where the blemishes were discovered while the bride is living under her father's house, so that's where they were discovered. So we can assume that that's where they originated, and furthermore we're adding, and before the Kiddushin. So therefore, the husband is believed to say, "Oh, this was before it came under my domain," and even before the Kiddushin, we assume it was already here before I came into the picture, and therefore the father would have to prove otherwise. Whereas Sefa nameh kanimsu v'chan hayu, Sefa applies the same principle, that the blemish happens in the place where it is found, and in this case, the husband finds it while she is living with him. So since it was found there, we assume that the blemishes occurred under his authority, which could be after the Nisu'in, or if it was after the Kiddushin, even so that between Kiddushin and Nisu'in period are a little blurry here in Rava's statement. That's what we're going to discuss in a second, right? Because on the one hand, she is living in her father's house. On the other hand, when they're discovered there, we still assume that it happened before the Kiddushin. Whereas when he finds it in his house, when she's living in his house, we assume that the blemishes occurred either after the Nisu'in or after the Kiddushin. So let's discuss that in between. Period. Itibe Abaye challenges Rava. Nichnesa l'rshut ha'ba'al sarich lehavi re'aya. Once she comes into her husband's domain after the Nisu'in, then the husband has to bring a proof that these blemishes happened beforehand, before the kiddushin. She'ad shelo titares hayu ba mumin elu, that happened before the kiddushin, and therefore he says mekach ta'ut, because if it happened after the kiddushin, then she can say it's your loss. And then he would say, if he can prove it's before kiddushin, he could say, I never wanted to acquire this woman with such blemishes. Okay, now that's true. Ad shelo titares in. That's only if he can prove that she got these blemishes before the kiddushin. Mishetitares la. But let's say he can only prove that she got these blemishes before the nisuin, but maybe after the kiddushin, and in that case, that he would not be believed, because even though they were before, he can prove they're before the nisuin, they still could be after the kiddushin, and so it would be his loss. And now Abaye's question is, ve'amai lema kanimsu v'chan hayu. Why don't we apply your principle that wherever they were found, that's where they happened? So even though the husband was only able to prove that the blemishes occurred before nisuin, why not say, well, since he already proved that they happened under her father's house, so then they must have occurred while in the father's house and before the kiddushin, right? If you can prove one, so it turns the case into, if you can prove that they were before the wedding, then that would turn the sefa case into the resha, where they were found while under the father's house. After all, if they're found in the father's house after kiddushin, he's believed to say they're before kiddushin. So even after the nisuin, as long as he proves that it occurred before the nisuin, so we should apply the same logic and believe him that it happened before the kiddushin. Okay, so good question, Abaye. Rava says, Amar le, mi shenitarsa mishum deika lememar, hazaka en adam shote bekos ela imken bodko, v'hira'avin payesu. If it's only found from the point of kiddushin, so then we're going to apply the following chazakah. Usually, a person is not going to drink a cup unless he checks it first. The mashal is, you're not going to use a cup, you're going to check to make sure it doesn't have cracks, it doesn't have a sharp edge, and then you're only going to drink. Nimshal is, a person, we assume, is going to make sure to check his new bride out before the kiddushin and to see if she has any blemishes, and only then he'll go ahead. So since we assume that he did check her out in some way, and then he saw these blemishes, so he means he's okay with it, he's reconciled with it. Therefore, if he only can prove that that the blemishes were found in her father's house, but he can only prove that they were there he cannot prove that they were there before the kiddushin, then we are going to apply this chazakah that he saw that even if they were there before the kiddushin, he probably saw them and still was okay with them. That's why he still has to pay the ketuvah. Okay, now Abaye will shoot back. In that case, even if the husband can prove that she had these blemishes before the kiddushin, we should still apply this hazakah and say that he must have done a check. Usually, people check their brides even before the kiddushin, and therefore he would have seen this blemish and would have been reconciled with it, and therefore should still have to pay. So you can't apply this chazakah because then it would go too far. No, bemumin. We have an opposite chazakah that says that a person is not reconciled. When he sees a blemish, a man is not okay with it, and he's not going to go ahead with the deal. And so we can apply that principle that's applied in other places here also, that we have a chazakah against it. So now we have actually two chazakot that are equal and opposite that would cancel each other out. So we go back to our Abaye's original question, and here Rava will explain his entire shita. Ela mi shenit aresa mishum deika tarte. Once a person has kiddush, if it's from the point of kiddushin and on, meaning if they're already married, but he can prove that this blemish was from before marriage, but he can't prove that it was from before Kiddushin. So all we know it was that it was for sure there, but before the marriage. But we only know that it was there before Kiddushin, after Kiddushin. We're not sure if it was there or not before Kiddushin. In that case, he's not going to be believed. The husband will have to pay. Why? Mishum t'ika terte, because it's 2 against 1. 2 chazakot against him. Chazaka amed guf al chazkato. Number 1, probably she has a chazaka of not having a blemish since he was born. And the blemish happened at some point afterwards. So we assume she has a bodily chazaka that she has not blemished. That's number 1 until later. So at the time of Kiddushin, she didn't have the blemish. Chazaka en adam shote bekos elaim ken bodko. A second chazaka against him is that people generally will check their brides before Kiddushin. So he probably checked her, and if she had the blemish, he saw it, and he was fine with it. So that's 2 against him. So what do you have for him? The other chazaka that usually people if they see a blemish, will not be reconciled. That's 1 against 2. 1 against 2 is not strong enough, and therefore the 2 chazakot win out. And if he can only prove that the blemish was there, this is after the Nisuin, and he can prove that the blemish was there before the Nisuin, but he can't prove it was before Kiddushin. So then the power of these 2 chazakot together say you have to pay. Whereas, if he can prove that the blemish happened before the Kiddushin, then we lose one of the chazakot against him, the chazakah of her body, that her body is presumably unblemished until you can prove his blemish. Now he proved that the blemish was there before Kiddushin, so that you lose out on that chazakah. So what do we have left? Chazakah adam shote bekos ela im ken bodko. So we have 1 against him that usually people do check their brides beforehand, and so he saw this blemish and he was okay with it, and then therefore he would have to pay. Adrabah, but we have a chazakah against it. Chazakah en adam peyes b'mumin. People are not reconciled when they find blemishes. Therefore, those cancel each other out, and we leave the money where it is. He has the money right now. She's trying to extract the money for the ketubah, but the chazakot are equal, and so that's the reason why we do believe him if he can prove that the blemish happened before the kiddushin, but if after they're married, he can only prove that the blemish was there from the kiddushin and onwards, but even if it's before the marriage, that won't help him because he has a majority of chazakot against him. We'll see the third explanation of the Mishnah by Rav Ashi on the next daf. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.